Okay, so in this section, we're going to be talking about render time geometry, which is just geometry that we generate only while we're rendering. The major advantage to render time geometry is that render engines are often optimized for handling geometry that it generates itself. And this allows us to render very complex images with a very lightweight scene. So we're going to start off with redshift curves, and in this case, I'm just going to start with a C40 circle spline, which you can see is not showing up in my render view. So we need to tell Redshift, hey dude, I want to see this as geometry, how can you help? So I've added a Redshift object tag, and you can see that we have this new curve tab, as Redshift has detected that we've placed this tag on a spline. So we're in disabled mode right now. I'm just gonna go ahead and enable hair strands, which you can think of more or less as a ribbon that's facing the camera. For now, this is the only option. However, another option will be available soon, which will effectively sweep your spline with a cylinder. So thickness does exactly as you'd expect. If I start walking it up, it gets thicker. And scale is pretty interesting. So if we take one end of our scale down, you'll see that at the start of the curve, we scale all the way down to 0. It begins to scale up according to our scale ramp. Now the scale ramp is just a 0 to 1 multiplier on your thickness. So if I set my scale ramp and then dial thickness up or down, you'll see that we retain that scaling. So moving on to resample curve. When you check this box, it'll enable the steps dialog. And effectively, this lets us manually change the number of samples that Redshift is using along our curve. So if I set this very low, you'll see that I'm changing the number of sides that my spline has by the number of steps minus 1. And that's because they're separate samples for the start and end of the curve. And if I just go ahead and open up this circle spline, we can see that's exactly what's happening. So a neat thing here is I can, for example, bring in a bunch of curves from another application. In this case, I made some curves in Houdini, and all I had to bring in were the curves instead of a much heavier geometry file. So I'll pop this guy on, see what it looks like, and now we see that we're generating a ton of geometry at render time with a very lightweight scene. So next, let's talk about point instancing. In this case, I'm using X particles to generate my points, and I've just scattered them on this plane I have in the background. And if I add the Redshift object tag to the XP emitter, you'll see we get another new tab, which is the particles tab. And if we go ahead and dive into mode, we see there are a bunch of options, and these are just ways of saying, hey, Redshift, here's a point, let's put something on it. So we'll start off with sphere instances, and we immediately see that for each one of these little particles I've got in my scene, Redshift has stuck a sphere on it. I have a bunch of different sizes here because in my XP emitter, I chose to give it a 100% variation in radius, so it goes anywhere from 0 to 10 centimeters. And then on top of that, I have a scale multiplier, so maybe I want these spheres to be like half the size. So in working with a scale multiplier like this, I try to keep this value set at 1 and get as close as I can with my incoming numbers, and then just use the multiplier to tweak from there. And I think this is a good habit to form, because if you have to come in and make last minute changes, or you open this scene file 6 months from now, or somebody else opens it 6 months from now, your values are going to make more sense because you don't have to remember that everything's being filtered through a multiplier later down the line. And that just makes life easier for everybody. All right, next up is point instances. I've turned off the background so it's easier to see what these guys do. Essentially, point instances are going to give you a bunch of disks that are just always facing the camera. The scale multiplier works the same way, and the same goes for quad instances, which is going to give you a bunch of quads that are also facing the camera. So next up we have custom objects, which is super fun and probably one of my favorite things about render time geometry. So whatever object we drag into the custom objects dialog are going to be instanced onto our points. So in this case, I'm going to take a cool little tree model that I have and scale it down so we can see it. If I flip the background on and let's change camera angles, you'll see we've really quickly instanced 10,000 of these tree objects. Now there's room for more. Let's throw in this pyramid object, and I'm gonna toss the shader on it, maybe scale it up just a little bit more. Oops, oh God. And you can see we can just keep adding models into this custom objects dialog, and we're just gonna keep scattering these objects. So under distribution, there's sequential or random, and to show this, I'm just gonna rescatter only 4 points in a really tiny area. And you're going to see if I flip between sequential and random, it's changing how it applies these models to the points. So sequential is just going to go down in line. So point 1 will be a tree, point 2 will be a pyramid, point 3 will be a tree, point 4 will be a pyramid. However, if I flip to random, you'll see it is just exactly that, completely random. And I can flip through the seeds here and we'll see that pattern changing. All right, so let's go over some of the other options that are available now for curves. By default, we have hair strands, but we also have a few other shapes that we can generate along our curves. So we have boxes, which you can see appears to sweep our curve with a box shape. We have cylinders, which will apply cylinders to our strand. Let me go ahead and up the steps a bit, and we can see more of them there. Cylinders can be useful if you are getting some weirdo shading errors or issues with hair strand mode on. You'll actually get a geometry or geometric shape from box and cylinders. As well, we have capsules, which is essentially the same as cylinders, just we have rounded edges, curve ends. We have cones, which essentially, applies a cone along the length of our curve. And we have strips, which, if you're familiar with spline wrap, kind of looks like we spline wrapped a plane on our object. And these are all very useful because it gives us options for how we want our curves to appear, and gives us quite a number of options for generating a lot of geometry at render time, just simply based off of our single curve.